The AFL-CIO officials did this in the name of anti-communism because they just didn't like Allende and his socialist policies, and so they thought they had a right to go in and interfere, working with the CIA to create this economic havoc.
Jeff Shirky is a labor historian, journalist, union activist, and assistant professor at the Harry Van Arsdale Jr. School of Labor Studies at SUNY Empire State University in New York City, New York. He is a frequent contributor to In These Times and Jacobin, and his scholarship has been published in Diplomatic History in Labor, Studies in Working Class History. He is the author of a new book, Blue Collar Empire, The Untold Story of U.S. Labor's Global Anti-Communist Crusade, How the CIA Used American Unions to Undermine Workers at Home and Subvert Democracy Abroad. Jeff, welcome to the Valley Labor Report. Thanks for taking the time this morning.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Really excited to have you. And the first question, I think, that is worth asking is, why write this book? What are you hoping that unions and that union members like myself and Adam and folks that are listening, we just got a comment in the chat, the Pocatello Central Labor Council is listening from Idaho right now. So what are you hoping that folks like us take from your examination of these sort of darker parts of the American labor movement's history?
I think it's a really crucial part of labor history, even though it is, not a, it's a kind of shameful, unfortunate part of U.S. labor history, but it's crucial in understanding the sort of trajectory of the labor movement in the 20th century, how we went from being, 35% union density, the strongest that the labor movement ever was in the United States before or since in the mid 20th century. And then, the decline that has happened since, where now it's only 10% union density. Of course, there's many reasons for that have been studied and discussed, just corporate attacks on unions and right-wing political attacks and deindustrialization and offshoring and all of that. But another part of the story, I think, has to do with the fact that while organized labor was so powerful in the mid 20th century after World War II, the high-ranking labor officials were devoting so much time and energy and resources towards waging this anti-communist crusade abroad, working hand in hand with the U.S. government, with the CIA, with the State Department, in just dozens of countries in Latin America, Europe, Africa, Asia, supporting U.S. wars, controversial wars, most infamously the Vietnam War. And I'm talking about labor officials here, not the labor movement at large doing these things. For the most part, rank and file members, local leaders, staff were not really even totally aware that a lot of this was happening in their name. And when they did become aware, in different instances during the Vietnam War or some of the interventions in Central America when Reagan was president in the 80s, the rank and file local leaders and unions pushed back and fought back against this. So part of what I'm hoping unionists will get out of this book is just, number one, learning this history, because often it hasn't really been discussed or talked about because it is so controversial, and it can sometimes almost seem like a conspiracy theory when you start talking about the CIA. But this is actual history, and we need to know about it in order to understand the importance of international solidarity with workers in other countries, and that as we are trying to rebuild the labor movement and organizing the unorganized, to also have discussions and think about what kind of labor movement do we want to have when it comes to questions of war and peace and internationalism, and what kind of relationship should top labor officials with the AFL-CIO or major unions, what kind of relationship should they have with the U.S. government? Does the rank and file have a say in all of that? So these are questions of union democracy as well. So I think it's just, again, a very crucial part of labor history that is mostly still not very well known, or only little bits and pieces of it are known. So I was trying to kind of put it all together into this one book, um, at least covering the Cold War time period, which is pretty, an important time period.
Right, right. And it's definitely something that a lot of people don't know. Even some of the people, as they were elected to their international's presidency, you tell a story about how AFSCME's, I think his name was Jerry Worf, was elected, or it was some character was elected to the presidency of AFSCME, and found in the international headquarters a literal CIA office. And he goes and he's like, what are these guys doing here? Why are they in my union headquarters? What's going on? And he kicks them out. And so people, even as he's running for the presidency of his international union, he's got no idea that the AFSCME is so entangled with the CIA that these spooks literally have an office in the union's international headquarters. I mean, it's really amazing how kind of under wraps some of this stuff is, and some of it is still coming out. I mean, one episode that's not in your book, I don't think I remember reading about this, was with the United Steelworkers and Firestone. There was a strike in the 1990s where the United Steelworkers was trying to do some corporate corporate attacks on Firestone. And they uncovered support of Firestone supporting a Liberian warlord because they have an agricultural plantation in Liberia. And so they wanted to kind of keep these people from organizing and from being able to have good wages and working conditions. And the United Steelworkers uncovered the support that Firestone had for the warlord. And in an agreement with basically in concession during contract negotiations, the USW agreed not to go public with this information. So, this was just in the 90s, right? And that was only uncovered in 2015 by ProPublica. And so some of this stuff is still relatively new and coming out. And one of the more troubling themes that you identify is how, in many cases, it was like self-started by officials within the AFL-CIO. Can you give us a rough timeline of the AFL's involvement in international affairs, particularly in the beginning, and how they were kind of really, going ahead of the CIA?
You could go as far back as 1898, the Spanish-American War, where the U.S. took over Puerto Rico and Guam and the Philippines and occupied Cuba, and really the 1910s with the Mexican Revolution and World War I, where the AFL president Samuel Gompers was trying to earn respectability and legitimacy in the eyes of the U.S. government and corporate America by sort of supporting the war effort and saying workers are not going to go on strike and disrupt, military production and things like that. So that's kind of how far back the AFL's involvement in foreign affairs goes. But the AFL was also, throughout the early 20th century, kind of this battleground between radicals, particularly communists, and business unionists like Samuel Gompers, where the leftist trade unionists, communists, and others were trying to pull the AFL and its affiliated unions and labor councils in a more class-conscious, militant direction, trying to, get out of craft unionism and propose industrial unionism, where all the workers in a single industry were unionized, which is not the way the AFL generally organized back then. And so throughout, especially in the 1920s, there were a lot of these internal battles in the AFL. And it ended up being the anti-communists who won and pushed all the communists and leftists out of the AFL, more or less. And then in the 30s, with the Depression and the New Deal and the creation of the CIO, a lot of those leftists and communists, went into the CIO and built up unions like the UAW and the United Electrical Workers, International Longshore Warehouse Union, and others, and were very inclusive, racially inclusive, gender inclusive, and rapidly organized millions of previously unorganized workers. So But the AFL remained strongly anti-communist. So then during World War II, you have the US and Soviet Union becoming allies to fight their common enemy, Hitler. And as the war was ending in 1945, there was a hope among some people in the United States that this alliance between the US and Soviet Union might continue in order to prevent some other world war from happening in the future. This is what Franklin D. Roosevelt wanted before he died. He wanted to continue this alliance with the Soviet Union in the name of international cooperation. And you see a little bit of that with the United Nations being created and including both the Soviet Union and the US, communist countries and capitalist countries. Even though they didn't have a lot in common, they decided to come together and form the UN. And likewise, major trade union confederations, labor federations in the Allied countries in Britain and France and the Soviet Union and the US came together in 1945 to create a new international labor group called the World Federation of Trade Unions. And the CIO joined on behalf of US labor, but the AFL actually boycotted it because it included communists. So even before World War II was actually over, and when the US and Soviets were still allies, AFL officials like George Meany, who eventually became the president of the AFL and AFL-CIO, were publicly saying, we don't want anything to do with the Soviets. We should not have peace with them because they're evil communists and we can't trust them and we can never work with them. While the CIO was actually trying to work with the Soviets still in the name of, again, international cooperation and world peace. And so the AFL created a new like international arm to start sending representatives to Western Europe, where some of the trade union federations, like in France and Italy, were led by members of those countries' communist parties, and to try to like create divisions within those other countries' labor movements to get the or non-communists to become full-fledged anti-communists and to break away and form rival separate labor federations. And the AFL was initially doing this on its own with very little money, very few resources, because the Cold War between the US and Soviets hadn't really started yet, in 1945, 46. It wasn't until more like 1947, 48 that the Cold War was really getting started and the CIA was created. And once that happened, the CIA looked at what the AFL had already been doing over the last couple of years of, dividing labor movements abroad along these Cold War battle lines of saying, pick a side, you're either with the United States or the Soviet Union, you're either with the capitalist, or so-called free world or the evil communist world. And so the CIA, by the late 40s, decided to kind of recruit the AFL and start giving more money, because the AFL, again, had been doing this on its own. But now, by about 1949, 1950, the AFL had lots of money and resources from the CIA to continue doing this work of trying to split labor movements, not only in Europe, but now also in Latin America and Asia. And this was the same time of the McCarthyism and the Red Scare in the US, and the CIO turned anti-communist itself. It broke away from that international body I mentioned, the World Federation of Trade Unions, and the CIO expelled its communist-led unions. And it was only a few years later, 1955, that the CIO then merged with the AFL. And so really the AFL-CIO was born as a product of the Cold War. And it was really founded in anti-communism as kind of like a founding ideology. And from there, just continued working with not only the CIA, but the State Department and U.S. Agency for International Development, and later the National Endowment for Democracy. These are all different agencies within the U.S. government's like foreign policy apparatus to continue trying to make sure that labor movements in other countries wouldn't embrace any kind of left-wing, militant, class-conscious political orientation. They would usually say communism, but it oftentimes, could be any kind of political movement that it may not have been communist, but if it was sort of opposing the power of the United States, opposing capitalism, then it would just be labeled communist. And the AFL-CIO, working with the CIA and State Department, et cetera, would kind of go in and try to, again, undermine those more radical labor movements and prop up more kind of business union, a more business union model of unions working hand in hand with corporations and with oftentimes, corrupt anti-communist governments across the world. And I think I argue in the book that that is partly what made it easier for corporations to move U.S. jobs overseas later on in the 80s and 90s with offshoring and deindustrialization, because the labor movements in some of these places in Latin America and the Caribbean and Asia, the more militant class-conscious labor movements that might have fought back against that exploitation of sweatshops and so on, they had all been undermined for many years by the AFL-CIO itself in the name of anti-communism.
Right. And most of the episodes in your book that you go over are interventions by the AFL-CIO or American unions in quote unquote third world countries. But there were also interventions in Europe, in France and Poland, in particular. And so could you give us an overview of the episode in France, because I think that one's worth digging into a little bit, just as an illustration of how, this kind of intervention in internal union politics of other countries has not only been limited to quote unquote third world countries. They've also intervened in Europe, and also because what they did in France was it was really sort of a playbook for a lot of the other, they followed a similar kind of plan in other countries. So what were some of the things that the AFL-CIO did in France to hamper the French labor movement?
So that's, really at the kind of the beginning of the story, or the beginning of the Cold War, when it was still just the AFL on its own before it merged with the CIO. France, coming out of World War II, of course, France had been occupied by the Nazis during World War II. And there was this anti-fascist underground resistance in France. And one of the leading players of the anti-fascist resistance in France had been the French Communist Party. And a lot of working class people in France, who were fighting against the Nazis, had joined the Communist Party, and they were organizing unions in major industries, in the French auto industry, railroads, electrical industry, et cetera. And so then, coming out of World War II with, the Allied victory and France being liberated, the Communist Party in France was actually pretty popular among the working class. And it even shared responsibility in this sort of coalition government that was formed at the end of the war. And the major French labor federation was and still is the CGT, the General Confederation of Labor, the CGT. And at that time, in the mid-40s, the CGT was really led by French communists. And so the AFL, again, being very anti-communist, didn't like this. So they sent a representative to France in 1945, only a couple months after the war ended, and his name was Irving Brown. Now, later, Irving Brown would go on to become a major CIA agent, bankrolled by the CIA for many decades, and he was also, for many decades, the AFL-CIO's main representative in Europe. But at this point, 1945, he was still relatively young. He was there on behalf of the AFL, again, with very few resources, but his mission was to split the CGT, to divide it down the middle between the communists who were leading, for the most part, in leadership positions. And by the way, they came into those leadership positions democratically through, democratic, rank and file electing them. They didn't, take over, which is often the language that is used. And there was a group of non-communists within the CGT, union officials, who, they weren't in love with the communists, but they were willing to work with them in the name of labor unity and the fact that they had been elected democratically to leadership. But Irving Brown kind of came in and sort of started whispering in the ear of the non-communists, saying, "Why do you want to work with these awful, dirty commies? And come along with the AFL and join the anti-communist movement, which they called free trade unionism. This idea that anything that's leftist is inherently unfree, and it's only freedom if you're pro-US and pro-capitalism." And to make a long story short, by about 1947, Irving Brown succeeded in getting these non-communist French labor officials to pull their unions out of the CGT and create their own separate, smaller labor federation called Force Ouvrier, Workers' Force, which then, once the CIA got up and running just shortly after this, was receiving a lot of money from the CIA to kind of stay afloat and become like a rival to the CGT. So long story short, the French labor movement was divided. And then, like you said, that became kind of the playbook for the AFL and later AFL-CIO in many other countries where the labor federation was not even communist, but just sort of left-wing, anti-imperialist, class-conscious. The AFL and later AFL-CIO would kind of jump in partnership with the CIA and the State Department, and get the sort of dissidents within those union federations to break away and form rival federations. And so then the different unions would be fighting amongst each other along these ideological Cold War battle lines, instead of fighting the boss and focusing on the well-being of the working class. It was more a lot of these Cold War intrigues going on.
Hey, 5 seconds, just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
I'd also like if you could give us an overview of some of what happened in Chile, because that story kind of encapsulates another important piece of the book, which is the willingness to support implicitly or explicitly really, really like dark forces that not only led to, like in France, the kind of degradation of labor unity and the distraction of people and the inability to come together, but the deaths of people. And I think it was Chile where even maybe it was somewhere else, but their support for some of these regimes even led to some of the AFL and CIO's own people being assassinated in these countries. But Chile is an interesting one, because Chile is one of the South American coups that a lot of people in the United States, or more people in the United States, at least on the left, are aware of than some of the other escapades. And so tying in labor's involvement in one of these more popular or more popularly understood episodes of American meddling, I think is a worthwhile endeavor while we're talking. So how was it that the AFL intervened in Chile?
So this was in the early 1970s, kind of jumping ahead in time. And yeah, in Chile, the socialist politician by the name of Salvador Allende, who's openly Marxist socialist, was a democratically elected president of the country in 1970. And the U.S. government at the time under the Nixon administration, again, was very unhappy about this. Because one of his goals was to nationalize a lot of the major industries in Chile, the copper industry, and like the telephone and telegraph lines that were owned by U.S. multinational corporations. So a lot of U.S. companies stood to lose a lot of profits from Allende's very popular policies, socialist policies. So the U.S. government wanted to get to work trying to undermine Allende and his government by stirring up economic turmoil and economic unrest that would then serve as, and it did serve as, justification for a military coup in 1973. Of course, September 11th, 1973, a lot of people referred to it as, the other 9/11. And the role of the AFL-CIO, because the AFL-CIO, again, top officials, not the whole labor movement, not the rank and file or even local leaders, but just the very top, officials, mostly without the knowledge of the rank and file. They had built up this close partnership with the U.S. government, the State Department, and CIA over the preceding 20 years or so, since the Cold War had started. So the AFL-CIO said, we want to do our part in stirring up economic unrest to undermine Allende and his government. And Allende, of course, was very popular with the Chilean working class because of his popular pro-worker policies, raising wages and providing more government social services, social spending, and that kind of thing. And the main Chilean labor federation, the CUT, CUT, was led by leftist, socialists, communists who were pro-Allende. So the AFL-CIO had a difficult time trying to influence the trade unions in Chile and the working class in Chile. So instead, the AFL-CIO officials partnered with more like professional associations of more kind of like upper middle class small business owners and physicians, as well as people who like owned and operated their own taxi cabs and buses and trucks. So and some of the also like the engineers and supervisors in some of the copper mines. And so these professional organizations were called gremios. And this is who the AFL-CIO was partnering with, because they couldn't get a foothold in the actual unions because the unions were so pro-Allende. And there were in 1972, 73, leading up to the infamous coup, a series of strikes, especially trucker strikes that, the trucks and the highways in Chile was sort of the main way of getting food and fuel and everything else, basic necessities, distributed across the country, because it's this long, narrow country that doesn't have a lot of like railroads, but it has all these highways. And the truckers were on strike for like weeks and weeks, and it was costing the Chilean economy lots of money. The basic supplies and food and other materials were not readily available to consumers because of these trucking strikes that the AFL-CIO was helping to organize and sponsor. And it, of course, turned out after the fact. In fact, after the coup, the U.S. Senate investigated and found out that the CIA had authorized up to $8 million to support the strikers, the truckers who were on strike, to support them throughout the strike so they can continue to make a living even though they weren't working. So it was like a strike fund provided by the CIA to shut down the Chilean economy and give the military an excuse to overthrow the democratically elected socialist government. And the AFL-CIO had kind of been the middleman in this process of sort of funneling this money to the truckers and these other professional organizations, gremios. And yes, it was the outcome after the coup, of course, was horrific, with thousands and thousands of working class people, trade unionists, and others, student activists, intellectuals being jailed, tortured, murdered, disappeared, unions being banned, and, terrible economic policies. Chile was sort of ground zero for neoliberal policies of privatization and deregulation and all these things that help corporations at the expense of the working class. The AFL-CIO had helped to, I'm not saying it was the main factor or anything, but it contributed to this coup that led to this, horrible military dictatorship in Chile. And the AFL-CIO officials, again, did this in the name of anti-communism because they just didn't like Allende and his socialist policies. And so they just thought they had a right to go in and interfere, and again, working with the CIA to create this economic havoc that led to the coup and led to this horrible dictatorship.
And so the AFL did this through various international organizations that it was the parent organization for. I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but it was AIFLD in a lot of Central and South America. There were also similar organizations, I think, in Europe and in Africa and in Southeast Asia. And in the, I think it was the late 1990s or the early 2000s, you talk about how, you know, there was something of a recognition, and you can tell me if there was ever any like formal apologies for any of this stuff, but there was at least some recognition that yeah, this was really bad. We we gotta fix this. And so they consolidated all of these international organizations across the world into the Solidarity Center, which still to this day operates as the international wing of the AFL-CIO. And so the line is today, you know, from the AFL-CIO is that we're not doing that bad stuff anymore, right? We're doing good stuff. We're supporting workers in other countries, which is something that we should do, right? I mean, we should, like, the point of this book on your part is not to discourage American workers from engaging in international solidarity efforts. It's to, you know, to reckon with what has been called that in the past and to, you know, encourage us to do better. And so I would want something like a Solidarity Center to exist. And so talk to us about the consolidation of these organizations into the Solidarity Center and some of the work that has been done by the Solidarity Center in the last 20 years and the extent to which this really is a break with the past, or maybe not. We're still not sure, I think is the ultimate thing. But yeah, talk to us about the consolidation and the last 20 years of international work.
Yeah, and I just want to repeat what you just said about, because it's important about the history, that all the stuff I've been talking about that the AFL-CIO was doing in other countries, all these interventions that were funded by the U.S. government. It wasn't like the AFL-CIO itself, but these, like you said, these sort of subsidiary organizations or institutes that they were often called in Latin America, the AFIELD, AIFLD, American Institute for Free Labor Development, and like you said, others in Africa and Asia. And so that's that's another reason why this story doesn't often get talked about or hasn't been studied as much, is because it can get so complicated with all these different layers of organizations and agencies and acronyms. And I think in some ways that was on purpose to sort of confuse people and everything. But yes, these different foreign institutes, foreign arms of the AFL-CIO in the mid-90s were consolidated into the Solidarity Center. This is partly because this is right after 1995, when new leadership came into the AFL-CIO, and the old guard of anti-communists like Lane Kirkland, who had been president of the AFL-CIO throughout the 80s and early 90s, was effectively forced out. And this sort of new generation, or they called it the New Voice slate, John Sweeney, from the president of the SEIU, became president of the AFL-CIO. So these new leaders were in place, and this was now after the end of the official end of the Cold War, with, you know, the Soviet Union had dissolved in 1991 at the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. And so the new generation of labor leaders who came in to the leadership of AFL-CIO were not as like obsessively anti-communist as the previous generation. And they, you know, a lot of these terrible interventions had already started coming to light by the 80s and early 90s. So they consolidated into the Solidarity Center in 1997, all these different foreign arms. And yes, ostensibly it is, I think, much better, because it's not driven solely by this anti-communist crusade or, you know, that kind of thing. But the Solidarity Center, from its origin in 1997 till the present, is still almost completely financed, completely funded by the U.S. government, by the State Department, by the National Endowment for Democracy, which the NED, which is a very controversial agency that many people have argued, and I think it's very reasonable to say it's sort of just another, the NED is kind of another facet of the CIA doing these interventions overseas to try to bring governments and unions and other institutions more in a more pro-US direction, and doing a lot of meddling in other countries' democracies. And this is where the Solidarity Center gets all of its funding from. It's not the money and the resources are not coming from the labor movement itself. And there have been some episodes in the early 2000s, especially like in Venezuela, when the US government was trying to overthrow Hugo Chavez, who they didn't like because he was a socialist, with the Solidarity Center being implicated in like an attempted coup against Hugo Chavez in 2002, or when George W. Bush invaded Iraq in 2003, suddenly the Solidarity Center's budget for Middle East operations increased. Took a huge increase in money coming from the U.S. government. So I think, to some extent, maybe there is still kind of like a lot of very close partnership, I guess, between the AFL-CIO and the U.S. foreign policy apparatus. And you asked if there was ever any kind of formal apology about all of the interventions during the Cold War. And no, there has not been any formal apology or recognition from the AFL-CIO leadership. In 2002, there was an effort in the California Federation of Labor, the California state affiliate or state labor federation that's affiliated with the AFL-CIO, tried to or did pass a resolution that basically said the AFL-CIO should apologize, should break all ties with the CIA, should open up, all of the archival documents that it has about this and kind of come clean about all of this. And that passed in the California Federation of Labor, but then it went to, I think in the 2004 AFL-CIO convention, some committee just sort of killed that resolution and it never made it to the convention floor. So I think, and this is what I also hope the book will do, is at least spark a conversation, a discussion, a debate within the labor movement about whether we want our foreign policy or our international affairs, which, like you said, and I agree, the U.S. labor movement does need to have an international presence and be in solidarity with other labor movements around the world. But do we want that to be financially dependent on the U.S. government and all of that, what that implies? Or do we want it to be something that's much more autonomous, run by and for and funded by workers ourselves, so obviously the impact would probably be a lot smaller or more limited than what the Solidarity Center can do with millions. I mean, I'm talking tens of millions of dollars per year from the federal government to the Solidarity Center. I don't think it would be that much money if it was all just being funded directly by unions themselves, but it would be, I think, much more focused and more principled and less controversial. But it's not for me to decide. But there should be, I think, discussion and debate, because maybe some people in the labor movement are totally fine with having the AFL-CIO's foreign policy be completely financed by the State Department or the NED. But I think there should be more conversation about it, at least, because again, so much of this has been done behind the backs of the rank and file, and without real democratic oversight from the membership. And I think that's what really needs to change.
Right. I will mention, I was trying to find a quote from Chris Townsend, and I saw a review that mentioned AFGE's president Ken Blaylock, and so I will say that AFGE's only mentions in your book are positive. AFGE, and so that is my union, and I don't want you to tell me anything else that didn't make it into the book. So,
that was for you. Yeah, that was
that is for me. I appreciate it, and we're going to end that part of the conversation, not talk about anything. But I was looking for this quote from Chris Townsend that I thought was interesting and potentially ominous. And that is that Chris Townsend reports, and I'm sure that the person he's talking about would dispute. I don't know if you asked her if she disputes his characterization, but he says that the International Affairs Director for the AFL-CIO, Barbara Shaler, this was some time ago, I don't know if she's currently the International Affairs Director, told Chris Townsend that, quote, the State Department controls the Solidarity Center's work in the countries that have either oil resources or Islamic insurgencies, and we can have the rest. And so that's, not good. And like you said, there should be a conversation about that. And when our unions are doing international work that we think is good, we should do good international work. It should be driven by the membership, and we should have a say in it, and we should be able to have a discussion about actually what's going on. So so I think Jeff, it was such a fascinating book. I recommend people check it out. Adam hasn't had time to read it yet, but he's a big conspiracy guy, and so I'm sure that he's looking forward to it. Adam, was there anything else that you wanted to ask Jeff before we let him go?
This was amazing. I really, really appreciated this interview. I learned a lot. I was vaguely familiar with some of this history, and mostly through reviews of your book, frankly. And I think you are doing exactly what you said in terms of starting a conversation. And we do need to have these conversations internally to the movement about what the direction of our foreign policy should be. We as a movement need to be speaking out on foreign policy, period. And we have seen some impressive work by a lot of unions speaking out for a ceasefire in Gaza, speaking out against the genocide there. I've been inspired to see that. I was mentioning before we brought you on the air that, learning some of this history, I wasn't aware of the labor connection, but learning, some of the broader history of the CIA interventions and America's bloody foreign policy abroad really is what kind of woke me up politically as a teenager and got me into politics, led me down this journey. I wouldn't have, discovered the labor movement probably had it not been for learning some of that history and in the context of the war in Iraq. And so I say all that to say how much I appreciate what you're doing and really appreciate you shedding light on this. And I think it's not surprising that there hasn't been the accountability for this in terms of a real examination of our legacy as a movement and particular people inside of it. And I guess my question would be, for those of us who are in this movement now and we don't want to repeat the past, we don't want to see this happen again, what are some of your thoughts there? Obviously, the funding aspect is one big piece of that, having the debate on whether we continue that. But just in a broader sense, what are your thoughts about how do we keep this sort of thing from happening, whether it's internal union democracy or other themes you want to touch on there?
Yeah, thanks. The genocide in Gaza, I think, and the response from the labor movement is a great example, I think, because when it started in October of 2023, the very first statements that came from the labor movement were coming from top union officials at the AFL-CIO, at the American Federation of Teachers, and some others that were kind of erasing the context of the conflict, if you want to call it a conflict, and just various kind of pro-U.S., totally pro-Israel, and really just sort of treating Palestinians as an afterthought, and Palestinian humanity and human rights and self-determination as sort of a non-issue. Those were some of the first statements from the labor movement. But what we saw very quickly was coming from, again, a lot of rank and filers, local leaders, staff, pushing unions to take a better stance, to actually call for a ceasefire, which early on was a controversial thing to be calling for. I mean, the White House in the months after weeks and months after October 7th didn't want anyone talking about a ceasefire. It was only because there was so much grassroots pressure, in part from the labor movement, that eventually the White House at least started paying like lip service to calling for a ceasefire. And we've also seen, again, because of a lot of grassroots rank and file action and organizing within unions, within central labor councils, several major unions have called for an arms embargo on Israel, and the AFL-CIO itself eventually was also calling for a ceasefire, at least not for an arms embargo. But this I think this is kind of impressive when you look at the history that I lay out in the book of how traditionally unions were always kind of falling in line with U.S. foreign policy and whatever Washington was saying about some war or foreign policy crisis. And the labor movement, to a large extent, over the last year or so, has been pushing against what Washington has been doing and challenging U.S. foreign policy. So I think that's exactly like the right thing that needs to happen more often on other issues. We were talking about Cuba earlier, right? And there's for a long time been a big movement to end the embargo against Cuba. And in many other countries around the world, the U.S. Is promoting kind of oppressive policies or oppressive governments, or just not caring about the will of the people in other countries and just wanting to enforce whatever's going to be good for U.S. multinational corporations. And so those are the kinds of things that it would be great if the AFL-CIO and our unions would stand against more often and speak out against. And, this mural behind me is, from the UE Hall in Chicago. And the UE, an independent union, right, United Electrical Workers, has over the last 30 years had a really amazing partnership with a Mexican union or Mexican labor federation called the FAT. And this mural is like a result of that, a Mexican artist coming to Chicago many years ago and painting this Hands of Solidarity mural. But what's happened has been like cross-border organizing of workers working for the same corporations like General Electric, or workers in similar industries, but in different countries and from different unions, coming together and working together to challenge the power of multinational corporations, challenge both the U.S. and Mexican governments when they're promoting policies that are anti-worker. And it's not dependent on the U.S. government. This partnership between the UE and FAT, it's completely independent, worker to worker all the way. And I think it's a great example of the kinds of labor foreign policy or labor internationalism that we can have that's much more based on actual worker solidarity. And again, the fact that the U.S. because of its military power, its economic power, really influences what happens in so many other countries and other countries' labor movements, workers all around the world, that as the labor movement here in the U.S., we kind of have a special responsibility, I think, to put more pressure and be more oppositional to U.S. foreign policy a lot of the time. If nothing else, and just for humanitarian purposes, to stop so many people being killed in wars that are either started by the U.S. or fueled by the U.S. through the provision of so many weapons and bombs.
Jeff Shirky, labor historian, journalist, union activist, and assistant professor. He is the author of a new book, Blue Collar Empire, The Untold Story of U.S. Labor's Global Anti-Communist Crusade. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. I really enjoyed the conversation and hope folks get some use out of it.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.
Which side are you on?